All right, a very good evening, everyone. Those are here and those are online. I think that's going to be the new standard part of our greeting. Those are here and those are online. But thanks so much for coming out. So the intention of this class is it's part of hopefully a series, I think, that the preaching committee is working that we're going to try out in the fall. And this is kind of an opening class, an introduction class. And it really, the purpose of this class isn't necessarily to give a lot of answers. The purpose of this class is more to ask questions and to kind of sow a seed of doubt, perhaps related to this topic. So I was talking to my mother-in-law. I thought maybe she was coming in, but that's actually Rob. So I remember she reminded me of a story that she had told me not long ago. So she works at a school here in Cambridge, and I forget exactly what it is. There's two young boys, fairly young, it's probably like grade 1, 2, something like that. And they had a pretty heated discussion. And one boy, I think he was raised here, and the other boy was raised in a Muslim family. A very heated discussion about whether Santa Claus was real or not. And basically they had the same argument, the exact same argument. And the argument was, my mother said so. Right? So the boy who said that Santa Claus was real, he argued this fiercely because his mother told him that Santa Claus was real. And the little Muslim boy argued just as fiercely, saying that his mother told him that Santa Claus was not real. And so they fully believed what they were told, right? And that's normal. I think that goes the same for us, right? We kind of tend to believe whatever parents tell you up to a certain age, and then you may or may not start to question those things. You may start to question them when they kind of come into conflict with other things that you see. So let's say, you go to grade 3 and all of a sudden you hear that, no, Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? And then eventually perhaps you start to figure it out one day that maybe he is real or he's not real. And I'm not here to decide on that. I don't want to ruin it for everyone. If you're still unsure, then maybe there's a psychiatrist that I can recommend you to. But Santa Claus is somewhat harmless, right? There's no, your life isn't gonna, crash and burn depending on whether Santa Claus is real or not. There are more damaging things that sometimes we can be told even by our parents and by our communities, right? So one example in the US would have been, something common that parents would tell their children maybe a few decades ago, but that white people don't marry black people, right? That was a very common thing. And that's something that children would have grown up with, and as they grew up, became teenagers, the fact was that this particular race does not marry this particular race. We don't intermarry. And those kind of things, if you're not challenged with that, and your community believes the same, and then at school maybe you're taught the same, perhaps even in your church you're taught the same, you don't really question that, and then that perpetuates, right? That belief, you continue to bring that with you. And those things are not so harmless. Those things are quite damaging to the health of a society, right? And so as we grow up, as we mature, you're taught things that may or may not be true. And unless you're kind of pushed to think critically, you continue to believe these things. So it isn't just parents, of course, that teach you these things, right? It's schools, it's universities, it's even governments. Right? And I'm not a huge conspiracy theory buff. I don't have time for that. But governments, they do say things that aren't necessarily true, and that's well known. I think the whole, like whatever is happening in Ukraine, right? One side calls it an unprovoked war, and the other side calls it a special operation, right? And everyone tries to tell their people that they're doing the right thing. And of course, we think, well, Russia is bad about propaganda and everything, right? And so we know that Russia's a bad country because essentially that's what we've all been told. America is essentially just as bad, right? The whole, does anyone remember the reason why the US invaded Iraq? Remember why the US invaded Iraq years ago? Yeah, weapons of mass destruction, right? We all knew it. we all knew there were those weapons of mass destruction, and America went in for good reasons. They're never found. Like, those weapons were never found, but we all knew they were there because our government told us so, right? And so as we go through life, we learn that things that we're taught are not always correct. And there's other powers as well, churches. There's an interesting account, and I find this one interesting. If you can't see what I see. There you go. So Galilei, he was a gentleman who kind of studied the astrology, and what he found, which is quite different than what was the mainstream teaching at that time. He found that, in fact, the Earth went around the sun, and not that everything revolved around the sun, right? So, or the Earth. So the common teaching was that the Earth was where it was; it stayed in place, and then everything else evolved around the Earth. And he figured, by looking through his telescope, that actually wasn't the case, that it was the Earth and the other planets that evolved around the sun. Now, what's interesting about this is that he, pushed against what the power be at that time in Italy stated. So the power be, the church in Italy, had stated that no, this is, the Earth is in place and the sun evolves around it. And it came to such a point where he was essentially telling the church that they were wrong. And that was no longer acceptable, right? And the church couldn't really put up with that. This was, somebody challenging their authority. It had not so much to do with the positions of the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth. It was more so about their power being challenged, right? Their authority being challenged. And so at this point, powers and authorities and people will say things that are not true because it affects their power or their position of authority, right? And so he was actually sentenced to house arrest for a while after, refusing to denounce his beliefs. He was put on house arrest until the day that he died, essentially. And this is only the church only really admitted that was correct, that his statement was correct, and that they were wrong in the 1990s, so a little bit later, right? That took a long time for them to change that admission. So there's other influences, other pop culture, particularly in our society, right, where we get a lot of information thrown our way, and if you see someone saying something that you don't agree with, then it's easy to challenge that, right? And particularly Trump was he was also all about fake news. I don't know if that was a word before he came into power, but he definitely popularized the whole fake news thing, right? And then to counter that, there was the other people, they're constantly fact checking him. And I don't think fact check was really that much of a much used term until he came in power. And then everyone was constantly fact checking everything that Trump was saying. And not sure how many facts were necessarily found in all of that, but it goes to show that when somebody says something that you don't agree with, it's easy to not believe it. But somebody that you value and that you respect, it's very easy to just believe what's being said, and particularly things online as well. This is probably one of my favorite quotes. This is a valid one by Abraham Lincoln. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of things we've just grown up with that we have come to believe. But if parents and your teachers and your universities and your community teaches you things, why would you question them? Unless you're ever really pushed to them. And so without questioning these things, we tend to perpetuate things that are wrong, right? And so, you may go through your whole life believing that Santa is real, and that's okay. But when you go through your whole life believing that certain races are not as good as other races, that is, of course, a problem, right? And unfortunately, that's something that we still see today. I think it's becoming less of an issue, but in Ireland, the Catholics versus the Protestants, that went on for generations and generations, where they would fight each other. And I think that's getting better now, but those things perpetuate generations after generations, right? With no real basis of truth to that. Another interesting thing, there's a church that quite strongly holds the rule, or the rule with their constituents, that you're not allowed to use contraception. And you wonder, why is that? Why would that be a rule? It's not really found anywhere in the Bible, but it's a rule because if the more children that are born into this religion, the more it keeps growing. And so when people have fewer and fewer children, that community naturally dwindles, right? And so when people hold power over other people, it's easy to believe that those things are true as well, and yet they perpetuate things that perhaps shouldn't be. And so if you do question these things, though, the reality is that you can then be alienated from your community, right? And so when you speak up against something that everyone else around you believes, and you say, well, no, this is wrong, this doesn't make any sense, why is this the way it is? You can easily get alienated by your community. And so it is with the theory of evolution, right? This is a popular theory. It's been around for quite a while, but really became very popular in the 1850s, 1860s, something like that, a little while ago now. But now it's essentially mainstream teaching, right? This is something that we're all taught in schools, most of us anyway. It's taught in universities. It is just it's a common understanding that this is a fact of life, that we evolved, that we essentially came from monkeys. You can debate with me whether it's apes or monkeys. I don't know. I don't know those details. But species evolved into other species, and then eventually humans came out of that as well. And if you were to speak up against that, and many scientists notice this, if you say that, well, I'm not sure if that's true, and I actually do think there's a God who created the earth and people, it's quite easy to get ridiculed and alienated in the scientific community. And so there's a certain degree of power that's held over people that are in that community, because you can quite easily lose a job or a promotion or credibility or whatever it is that's important to you. Now, Charles Darwin, he's kind of the one who he wrote The Origin of Species, and that's where he has this very detailed description of how what the origin of species are, and then how they developed over time to form all these different species, where humans is supposedly one of them. Now, it's an interesting theory, of course, and it's based on some logic, it's based on reason. It's not completely made up stuff. He had some evidence to kind of back up his theory, but that's all it is right now, right? It is a theory. In science is the study of events, it's the study of facts, it's the study of things that we can observe. And then you make some kind of hypothesis, right? You make some kind of theory that, well, I see the sun every day, and so the sun seems to rise every day, and so something causes the sun to rise every day, and then you start to look into it, and you do some kind of test. And that's what science is. You come up with a theory, you test that to see if it happens under different circumstances, and if it does happen in these circumstances, then you can start to make some conclusions. That's very difficult to do with evolution, right? We can find certain theories or things that support evolution, but it's very hard to test that, right? It's very hard to say, well, that if we have two planets and we have these organisms, let's see if they react in the same way. It's very hard to do, and so evolution isn't a fact. It is a theory, like there are many theories out there, right? It's not unreasonable, like I said, there is some thought behind it, and yet many people assume that this is a fact, right? And then you start to get into some discussions, or you make a discovery and you say, well, I observed this, and because of the theory of evolution, because evolution happened, therefore it must be this and this and this. And that's now bad science, right? Where you start to base theories on other theories that haven't really been proven, right? You wouldn't do that in a medical field. Like vaccine for COVID wasn't developed based on things that they couldn't prove, right? There's a lot of proof and evidence that went along with that, and then they started to make some decisions and some recommendations. But it wasn't based on, here's an idea that we can't really prove, and we're going to build on that. Right? That would be bad science. I would say that the same is for evolution, right? Where if you start to build theories around or based on the theory of evolution as a fact, that's not necessarily correct. So the age of the Earth, I think it's estimated now the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Those dating mechanisms, have they been proven? Are those theories that have been tested? It's hard to say, right? It's hard to, like, we haven't really observed how rocks and those things change and how the influence on rocks changes over 1,000 years. We don't know. And so to say that, well, this is how a rock behaves under these certain circumstances, we can test it over maybe 100 years, maybe we've been able to do that. But to say that, well, this is how it reacts, it's all the circumstances change around this rock. How do we know that our theory still holds water after 1,000 years? We simply don't know that. And so, I mean, it's an estimate, it's a theory, it's an idea that the Earth is 4.5 million years old, but it's hard to prove that, right? And so you can't say, well, this is a fact. I'm going to base my theory, I'm going to base my beliefs on something that is not necessarily true. Right? Evolution. Have we ever observed any real change from one species to another species? We haven't observed it. And it's interesting that skeletons are found in certain places, and you see, well, this let's say the size of the skull doesn't quite fit with human or Homo sapiens, whatever the official term is. It doesn't quite fit with ape or monkey, and then say, well, this must be a step that's in between. Well, why? I mean, this skeleton, it could be, I don't know how old it is, but it could be thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years old. I mean, now today you see people that are born with, let's say, abnormally sized heads or other, unusual shapes of their body, right? An extra digit. People are still born with that today. How come this one skeleton that's found somewhere that's supposed to be a million years old, how come that person wasn't born with an unusually sized head, right? It's certainly a plausible theory, but it's not a fact. You can't prove it. It's not tested. We haven't seen how this reacts as we test this theory, right? And so the likelihood of this Earth being habitable without design is infinitely small. Statistically, it's essentially zero. And I try to understand how small the chances are, and there's way too many numbers, and there's big numbers and smaller numbers, and I didn't say anymore, but the reality of it is that chance, that likelihood, is extremely small. Statistically, it is zero. And so when many scientists are questioned on that, it's like, how come this is a fact? How come this is this is presented as a fact, even though statistically it is extremely small? And the answer is, well, the fact that we're here proves that no matter how small the chance, it did happen, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. That's not a very good explanation, right? That doesn't explain anything about how we got here. Just the fact that we're here doesn't mean that one theory about how we got here is the truth, right? There are other theories that are certainly around in the Earth. So the creation theory, on the other hand, right, will say, well, this ape-like creature, it can't be evolution because humans are created distinctly different, and so therefore this theory of evolution, or the idea that this ape-like creature must have been part of some evolutionary step, that's not correct, because people were created. And so because of you hold one belief one way or another, you then automatically discount any other theory because you hold them as not true without really having any evidence for those not being true. It's just like Santa and interracial marriages and these weapons of mass destructions. Parents, societies, schools, governments, powers, influences, they'll say whether certain things are true or not. But the reality is, just because people say these things are true doesn't necessarily make them true, right? Now, our society will tell you that as a species or as societies, we're constantly progressing. we're better than we were 10 years ago or decades ago or centuries ago, right? We've progressed. And in particularly lately, in the last 50 years or so, we've kind of released ourselves of the shackles of religion, right? That bound us with these rules. And we can do so much more, right? There's so many more things that we can do right now. We can entertain ourselves with so much more. We can do things that were socially frowned upon. Essentially, there's no limits to what we can do or what we can be, right? There's no more restraints in life. People can essentially do whatever they want, as long as it doesn't seem to harm anyone else. But it doesn't have to, you don't have to be a scientist to really figure out that something just doesn't seem quite. Who here has issues with allergies? Who's allergic to anything? Just raise your hand up nice and high. A little bit higher. All right, so I'd say there's a late admission there in the back. So there's some allergies here. Who has noticed that these allergies that as society we seem to have seem to be getting worse? People are getting more allergies than we did maybe 10 or 20 years. Is that something that you're seeing? See one hand. Thank you. I think in general we're experiencing that, people are getting more allergies. But everything around us is essentially perfect. Like our food is completely healthy. We know that, the government tells us so. All of the medication that we take, they're all good for us, right? They've been studied and it's been approved by a board of government officials who know these things. Right? They've approved these things, so they're safe for us. Our environment is safe, right? The water gets tested, the air quality gets tested. All these things are good for us. Vaccines are good for us. They've been tested and they've been scientifically shown that these are not bad for you. Yet something seems off, doesn't it? Something doesn't quite seem right. And the allergies is just one example of something that, even though we're told everything that we do, everything that we consume, it's all perfectly safe and healthy good for us, something isn't quite right. right? And there's a small number of people that still think that the earth is flat. And funny enough, that group is growing, which is great. But why are there so many people that believe that this world was created, right? It's not this crazy idea that's out there. It's an idea that many people have. Why is that? And going a little bit further, why is there this one nation that's been around for thousands and thousands of years as well, that has been persecuted by so many different people where they've always lived, and that nation has survived all of that persecution, and they're, by some people at least, called God's people? Why is that? What does that have to do with God? Who are they? There are a lot of questions that we can start to ask once we allow ourselves to think maybe beyond what we've always been taught, right? If we say, well, evolution is a theory, it's a reasonable theory, but what if it's not true? Then we can start to look at some of the questions, right? Why were we created? What is the purpose of that creation? Is there going to be anything after we die? Right? I mean, we all know there's two facts in life that still remain: taxes and death, right? What's after that? It's a good question to look at. And is there something that I can do about that, right? Is there something like can I influence my own death, or whether there's something after that, right? If I die, do I have any say? Is there anything I can do to prepare? It's a reasonable question to look at if you know that there is something after death, right? Then a lot of religions claim that they can explain to you what you can do after you die. Is there some kind of responsibility that you have? Right? You've been put on this earth. You were here. If you're created and you're put here by some creator, does he have a responsibility for you? Is there something that you have to give accountability for what you did in your life? Who is the one who created, right? Is it God? Is it Allah? Is it Jehovah? Is it Vishnu? Those are all reasonable questions to ask. And you can only start to ask those questions once you've accepted that one theory that you've been taught your whole life of evolution isn't necessarily the truth. And so ultimately what we're trying to encourage you, which I think most of you have done already, is to start to question these things, right? To question, well, is this really true? Why do I believe? And that goes for all things in life. It's perfectly okay to question these things, as long as you're open to reason through them, right? As long as you're open to to ask the questions: why do these things happen? Why do I believe what I believe? Is there a foundation? Is there proof? Ultimately, you all need to have faith in something, right? None of us were there, whether the world created, whether it came from a big bang, whether you have some old school theories where this world is a shadow of another world, right? Those are Plato or Socrates. One of them had one of those ideas that everything that happens there is just merely a shadow of, I don't know, gods or some other creation, right? All those theories are interesting to look at, but what is it based on? Right? Is there something you can improve? Is it a reasonable thought? Is it a reasonable theory? And then you start to dig into those things, right? And ultimately you make your decision based on what seems most reasonable, most plausible, which one answers some of the more difficult questions. And so that's what we're going to do in future classes. We're going to look at some of these alternative options. We're going to look at some of the theory of creation, the theory of a God, the fact that God created this world and that he created it for a purpose. So we're going to explore that theory and explore some different options, because, like I said, there's a whole variety of options that are out there on who created us and what the purpose of our creation is. And so we're going to look at a few of them in some future classes. So we encourage you to come out again and look at the evidence, because there is a lot of evidence. Right? So we encourage you to look at the evidence yourself. Forget the things that you've been taught for years and years as a fact, as a truth beyond reasonable doubt. Be open to other ideas, and then ultimately make your own decision on whether you created by God or whether you came from a monkey.